Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're wading into a topic that's relevant to pretty much everyone. Leases.
Yeah, leases, landlords, tenants, the whole shebang. We're going to unpack the ins and outs and hopefully give you some ammo for, navigating this stuff in the real world.
Exactly. And we're taking a deep dive into your document, by the way, chapter 11.pdf. We're going to unearth those hidden clauses and break down those legal terms, especially the ones that directly affect you as a renter.
Because believe me, there are more rights you have than you probably realize.
Absolutely. So the document starts off with the different types of leases. Term of years is pretty straightforward. You sign on for a fixed period, like say, 1 year lease. Pretty standard stuff.
Right. And then you've got periodic tenancy, which is your classic month-to-month situation. It just keeps renewing automatically until someone, you or the landlord, decides to end it.
Right. Okay, and then it gets a little less familiar. There's tenancy at will. This one's a bit more flexible, right? Either side can end things relatively easily as long as they give proper notice.
Exactly. It's based more on like an ongoing agreement rather than a strict timeline. And lastly, we have the one you really want to avoid. Tenancy at sufferance.
Yeah, that sounds ominous.
It basically means you've overstayed your welcome. Your lease is up, but you're still hanging around. Not a good position to be in. Definitely not ideal.
Definitely not. So I thought it was interesting how our good old monthly rent checks actually determine what kind of lease we're in.
Mm-hmm.
By making those regular payments, we're basically agreeing to that periodic tenancy, right?
Exactly. Each month, you're essentially renewing the agreement. And here's where it gets really important, especially in your case. Courts tend to be a bit more, shall we say, understanding when it comes to residential leases versus commercial ones.
You mean they cut us regular folks a little more slack?
In a way, yeah. They recognize that, most people looking for an apartment aren't exactly legal eagles, or they're not going to comb through every line like a seasoned business owner negotiating a lease for office space.
Makes sense. It's a very different playing field. And speaking of protecting tenants, I was surprised to see consumer protection laws mentioned. I always thought those were totally separate from landlord-tenant disputes.
It's a really interesting and relatively new area of law that's emerging. Courts are now trying to figure out if landlords, even those just renting out a single unit, are actually engaging in trade or business.
Because if they are, then tenants might have even more rights under consumer protection laws.
Exactly. And that could have a huge impact on the balance of power in these situations.
That's a really good point. The document even mentions this case, Vasquez v. Glassboro Service Association. Migrant farm workers were basically evicted with zero notice. I mean, talk about a David and Goliath situation, right? You wouldn't think they'd have a leg to stand on.
And that's what makes that case so fascinating. Yeah, you'd think that, wouldn't you? But the court actually took a closer look and realized something crucial in that case.
What's that?
Power. It all boiled down to power. The court basically said, look, even though this isn't your typical lease situation, there's a clear imbalance here.
Yeah, I mean, those workers were really at the mercy of, well, everyone, weren't they?
Exactly. And the court said that just couldn't fly. They deserve some basic protections. The court actually compared it to those adhesion contracts we see in the consumer world. Those agreements where you basically have no bargaining power. Take it or leave it.
Oh, like those user agreements we all just blindly click agree on?
Exactly. So this whole idea of consumer protection bleeding into landlord-tenant law, it's really starting to gain traction.
Yeah.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, we're talking about people's homes here.
Absolutely. And it's not just about those formal lease agreements anymore, right? The document also mentioned how the sharing economy is playing a role in all this, Airbnb, Vrbo, all that.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Short-term rentals are definitely changing the game, no doubt. And cities are starting to feel the pressure too. I mean, look at places like New York and San Francisco. They're putting stricter regulations in place, trying to find that balance.
Makes sense, especially in those cities where affordable housing is already such a hot-button issue. So how do you think all of this shakes out in the future of renting?
It's hard to say for sure. It's like the Wild West out there right now, but one thing's for certain. The lines are getting blurry.
Between traditional leases and this new wave of rentals.
Exactly, and the law is scrambling to keep up. But hey, speaking of tenant rights, there's one in here I bet you can appreciate. Quiet enjoyment.
Quiet enjoyment. Okay, now that does sound enjoyable.
Right. It's basically the right to, peace and quiet in your own home. I mean, that seems pretty basic, but you'd be surprised.
So what does that look like in reality? Does that mean my neighbor can't practice their tuba at 3 a.m.?
That's the general idea. It means the landlord can't interfere with your ability to, just live in your space without constant disruptions. And it's not just about noise. I mean, that's a big one, obviously.
Especially in those paper thin-walled apartments.
Tell me about it. But it could be other things, too, like the document mentions a landlord who kept barging in to do inspections.
Oh, come on. Really? Like, how often are we talking here?
Like every month. Totally unnecessary. The tenants were like, dude, back off. We're trying to live here.
I can't imagine. I'd be furious. Did the court side with the tenants on that one?
Oh, big time. And that brings up another really important case. Minjek Covey Randolph. We're talking next-level bad landlord behavior in this one.
Okay, how bad are we talking?
Flooding. Dust everywhere. Stairs that were practically falling apart. A complete nightmare. And guess what? The court didn't just say, yeah, landlord, you messed up. They actually hit the landlord with punitive damages.
Whoa, punitive damages. That's got to be serious.
It is. It's basically the legal system's way of saying, not only were you in the wrong, but you need to be taught a lesson.
Wow. Okay, so quiet enjoyment really runs the gamut from noisy neighbors to, like, hazardous living conditions.
You got it. It's a pretty broad concept. And speaking of broad concepts, we can't forget about habitability. This one's a biggie.
Habitability. That one sounds pretty self-explanatory.
It basically means the place has to meet some basic living standards. It can't be a total dump. We're talking heat, running water, the works. Think of it this way. You wouldn't buy a car that didn't run wreck.
No way. I'd be demanding a refund.
Well, same principle applies here. Except instead of a car, it's your home. And that's where the implied warranty of habitability comes into play. It's like this fundamental agreement that's built into every lease.
So even if it's not explicitly written out in the lease, landlords are still on the hook for providing a safe and livable space.
Bingo. And your document mentions this landmark case, Javins v. First National Realty Corp. This one really shook things up.
Oh yeah, Javins. That name rings a bell. What happened in that one?
So you had these tenants living in a building riddled with housing code violations. I mean, we're talking hundreds of violations. And get this. The landlord was trying to argue that they weren't responsible for fixing any of it.
Seriously, what was their reasoning? That's outrageous.
I know, right? Thankfully, the court wasn't buying it. They basically said, hold on a minute. If you're renting out an apartment, it has to be habitable. It's not just some rundown shack you can ignore.
So the court sided with the tenants.
They did. And it was a huge win for renters everywhere. You see, up until that point, renting was seen as this temporary arrangement, kind of like you're just borrowing the space, deal with it.
Oh, wow. So this case was really groundbreaking.
It was a game changer. It established a whole new standard for landlord accountability. And the best part, it helped solidify the whole idea of tenants having rights. I mean, before that, it was pretty much a free-for-all.
Wow, that's amazing. So what happens if the landlord isn't holding up their end of the bargain? If the place is unlivable or if they're constantly violating the whole quiet enjoyment thing, what can tenants do? Can they fight back? There's got to be some recourse for tenants, right? They can't just, like, sit there and take it.
You'd be surprised. Well, actually, maybe not. But the good news is the law does offer some options. For example, in some cases, you can actually withhold rent.
Wait, really? I can just, like, stop paying rent if the place is falling apart.
Whoa, hold your horses.
Yeah.
It's not quite that simple. It's definitely not a free pass. But if the problem is serious enough that it's affecting your ability to actually live there, and this is important, you've already told your landlord and given them a reasonable chance to fix it, then, yeah, withholding rent can be an option.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about being like, I don't want to pay rent this month.
No, definitely not. You got to be smart about it, follow the rules, document everything. But it can give you some leverage in those situations where the landlord's just dragging their feet.
Right. Makes sense. So what else can tenants do besides the whole rent withholding thing?
Well, depending on the issue and, where you live, you might be able to fix the problem yourself and just deduct it from the rent.
Oh, really? Like, just DIY it and call it a day?
Well, not exactly call it a day. You got to make sure you keep records of everything. Communication with the landlord, proof that you requested the repair, receipts for any materials you bought.
Gotcha. Cover your tracks.
Exactly. And if those options don't work, there's always the nuclear option.
Nuclear option? You mean like suing the landlord?
Yep. Tenants can absolutely sue if the landlord is in clear breach of the lease agreement.
I mean, that makes sense, but I feel like going to court over a leaky faucet is a bit,
extreme.
Yeah, and probably expensive.
Yeah, it can be a hassle for sure. And costly, which is why it's usually a last resort. But there are organizations out there that can help. Legal aid, tenants' rights groups, that sort of thing. Don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Okay, that's good to know. But let's say a tenant does speak up or even like threatens legal action. Can landlords retaliate?
Ooh, that's a good question. And it happens more often than you think. But thankfully, the law does offer some protection against retaliatory eviction.
Retaliatory eviction? That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Basically, it means a landlord can't just kick you out for complaining about legitimate issues, like demanding repairs or reporting safety hazards. Your document even mentions this case, the Hillview case, where the tenants were able to successfully fight back against this.
Oh, wow. So there's like legal precedent for this.
Absolutely. The courts have recognized that tenants need to be able to exercise their rights without fear of reprisal.
That's reassuring. But I'm guessing there are limits to this protection, right?
Right. I mean, if you're not paying rent or doing other things that violate the lease agreement, well, you're still on thin ice. This protection isn't a free pass to, stop paying rent just because you don't like the color of the walls. It's about ensuring you're not being punished for raising legitimate concerns.
Right. It's about fairness on both sides.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Understanding your rights, but also upholding your responsibilities as a tenant.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. We've covered so much ground. Different types of leases, consumer protection, quiet enjoyment, habitability, retaliatory eviction, even how tenants can fight back against unfair situations. It's a lot, but man, it's empowering stuff.
I agree. And remember, this deep dive was just a starting point. It's crucial to dig deeper and find out the specific laws in your area. Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for walking us through all of this. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights into your rights as a tenant.
And maybe even inspired you to, take a closer look at that lease agreement.
For sure. We'll catch you all on our next deep dive.